Have you ever wondered why your knees may cave in during a squat? Or has a coach or a physio ever told you that if your knees continue to collapse in, you'll catch a serious case of Ebola? Today, we're going to be taking a look at knee valgus, what that really is, and whether or not it's an issue that you should even address. So without further ado, let's run the intro. What's up guys, Dr. Peter Yu here, physiotherapist and strength coach. Today I wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about knee valgus or the knees caving in. Over the last couple of years, knee valgus has always been a pretty hot topic of debate in the sports performance, rehab, and coaching world. Traditionally, knee valgus has always been thought to be a dangerous and harmful movement that should be avoided at all costs. But are the knees caving in something really as bad as what people make it out to be? Before we go any further, we have to define what knee valgus actually is. We can typically define valgus as a combination of movements occurring which typically include femoral adduction, where your femur and thigh come in towards the center of your body, femoral internal rotation, where your thigh rotates in, knee abduction, tibial external rotation, where your shin bone is rotating out, and possible pronation of the ankle, where we'll see a collapse of the ankle arch. While this certainly may seem like an abnormal position, we typically need just a little bit more context to the exact situation where knee valgus occurs before deciding whether or not it's acceptable. And so with knee valgus, we'll typically see it occurring in two different categories. The first category being that of team sports such as basketball, football, and soccer, where we'll see athletes usually demonstrating some form of valgus on the knee, typically with dynamic cutting, running, or landing after jumping. The second common category where we'll see athletes demonstrate knee valgus is typically in barbell sports such as Olympic weightlifting. In this category, we'll typically see athletes demonstrate bilateral knee valgus on both legs as they are coming up out of the bottom of a squat position. If we take a deeper look at the first category involving team and field sports, we'll typically see athletes demonstrate a ton of running, cutting, and jumping movements, which honestly aren't really seen that much in barbell sports involving squatting patterns. Taking a look at the literature, we know that if you're jumping and landing on a stiff knee at a high velocity with knee valgus, it's going to be a pretty well documented mechanism of injury and cause for ACL tears within those demands. A study in 2014 utilized cadavers to stimulate landing impact after jumping in order to view the effects of dynamic valgus on the ACL and MCL. They found that a combination of rotational valgus forces occurring at the knee and the hip had increased shear forces on the ACL, which caused tears after landing. This study also showed that these forces and tears all occurred within milliseconds of contact with the ground at around 25 degrees of knee flexion or less. This basically tells us that the ACL is torn even before the athlete has time to react, and that typically ACL tears occur when landing on a stiff knee, usually around 25 to 30 degrees of knee flexion at a high velocity with knee valgus. If we take a look at Klay Thompson and Derrick Rose's ACL injury in the past, we see that both of these players decelerating and landing on one leg with a fairly stiff knee at a high velocity with a rotational valgus moment occurring. Eric Mira, in a recent Clinical Athlete podcast on knee valgus and the ACL, does a pretty good job of summing it up, where he says, in the perfect environment with all the right variables in place, the ACL is torn even before the foot hits contact with the ground, and that there's nothing the athlete can do to prevent it from happening besides simply giving up on the play. And truth be told, giving up on a play is simply an option that an athlete is never going to consciously make on their own. Interestingly enough, even though knee valgus is a direct mechanism for ACL injuries within those demands, it's also a movement that we see high-level athletes demonstrate all the time. And honestly, it's a pretty cool display of how adaptable and amazing the human body can be. Here we see my guy Kobe, Alvin Kamara, and Lindsey Vonn all displaying this amazing dynamic knee valgus while playing at the top of their game. To be honest, game time situations are often unpredictable, and there are often circumstances and situations that we can't control. While we can't completely prevent these injuries from occurring, there are certainly some factors that we can take into consideration in order to potentially decrease risk, as well as to help prepare our athletes to be ready for unpredictable situations in games. Some of these factors include taking a look at overall load management, sleep, stress, and recovery leading up to games. Additionally, knowing that the majority of ACL injuries occur around 25 to 30 degrees, we could also encourage more knee flexion when landing in order to hopefully help dampen forces occurring on the ACL. We'd also want to train our athletes to be as strong as possible, especially in the quads and the hips, and hopefully at an intensity close to in-game demands. That way, our athletes are confident and have experience with tolerating and handling loads generated in those high-intense situations. Finally, we could also possibly do some controlled training into valgus. Knowing that this is a movement that's going to be inevitable, we might as well do the best we can to help prepare our athletes to meet the demands of the sport. How that will look, I'm not exactly too sure. Doing squats and lunges in a valgus position is one thing, but to be able to create a safe and controlled environment where an athlete is completely distracted and landing on a leg in a high impact, high velocity situation, similar to that of an in-game scenario, will be fairly hard to do. So in conclusion, it's tough, Unilateral knee valgus is bound to happen in games no matter what. And yes, while landing on a stiff knee is a direct mechanism of ACL injury that's pretty well documented, it's also a movement that we see high-level athletes demonstrate all the time and be able to tolerate the movement and forces. So while we can't completely prevent it from happening, we can definitely do our best to help prepare our bodies to meet and tolerate those demands the best we can, and thus hopefully decreasing some percent of risking that injury. Moving on to the second category of barbell sports, we'll typically see valgus being displayed as the athlete is coming up from the bottom of a squat position. Unlike sports such as basketball, football, and soccer, there really isn't a distinct mechanism of injury when it comes to valgus and squats. You're not running, you're not cutting, you're definitely not jumping and landing on one foot. And when you squat, you often squat well below 25 to 30 degrees of knee flexion. So then why the hell do we have so many physios and coaches demonizing knee valgus in a squat position? Hey Johnny, push those knees out before you get a case of knee bola. You want to blow an ACL? Keep squatting with your knees caved in like that, man. Knees out. Knees out. Knees out. Ouch. My knees hurt just looking at that. Let's take a look at what the literature actually does say about knee injuries in barbell sports. A systematic review by ASA in 2017 took a look at injuries in weightlifters and powerlifters. They found that weightlifters and powerlifters on average only sustained about 1 to 4 injuries for every 1,000 hours of training, which is a lot smaller than the rate of injury for wrestling and football players. Another study by Calhoun in 1999 took a look at injury rates and profiles of elite competitive weightlifters. They followed elite US male weightlifters at the United States Olympic Training Centers, and they analyzed reports from a 6-year period. While they found that the low back, shoulders, and knees were in fact the most commonly injured areas, they found that the majority of the knee injuries were in fact classified as tendinitis, or an overuse injury. Overuse injuries typically occur when there's high volume and high load that's accumulated over time. This is actually pretty consistent with the study, as we see that the majority of the lifters, on average, typically only missed about 1 day of training due to an injury. So from this, we can probably conclude that the majority of common knee injuries seen in weightlifters are probably going to be due to more of a chronic tendinitis issue, whereas in team-based sports, we see that ACL tears are more due to a sudden traumatic acute accident. Another study by Roske in 2002 took a look at injury rates and prevalence among elite weightlifters and powerlifters in Sweden. They actually found that female lifters had a considerably amount of lower knee injuries when compared to the male lifters. This is pretty significant because usually in team-based sports such as soccer, football, and lacrosse, we see our female athletes having a much higher significant ACL injury rate, typically 2 to 10 times more than when compared to our male athletes. Whereas in powerlifting and weightlifting, we actually see a decrease in the number of knee injuries in our female lifters. Another common thing that you'll hear is that, oh, your knees are caving in because you must have weak glutes, or your hip abductors are weak. Here are some world champions with weak glutes, I suppose. Here's 2-time Olympic world champion Long Ching Kwan cleaning 3 times his body weight for 169 kilos, or 4-time Olympic gold medalist Ilya Ilyin cleaning 246 kilograms with a sweet side of knee valgus. That's 541 pounds of freedom units, by the way. Yeah, Must be those really weak glutes. Or 5-time world champion Liu Xiaojun. We see even my girl Maddie Rogers falling into the weak glutes club. Sorry Maddie, your knees are collapsing in. Why don't you strip some weight off that bar and go join Mr. Liu Xiaojun in that corner where y'all can do some banded clamshells and banded side steps so you can really strengthen up those weak glutes. Can we take a moment to pause and realize how ridiculous that sounds and actually is? Yup, you can clean 400, but sir, you must have weak glutes because your knees are still caving in. So if knee valgus in the bottom of a squat position isn't due to having weak glutes, why does it occur? I think we can attribute it as a result to a positive adaptation of training, as well as some of the muscles in our body simply performing the actions and movements that they were made to do. A study in 2018 took a look at EMG results of the adductor magnus muscle during different movements, and they found that it was actually the most active during hip extension, the movement occurring when coming up from the bottom of a squat. Funny enough, the adductor magnus muscle is more active during hip extension than the movement it was actually named after, hip adduction. Another study by Valgus in 2016 looked at the amount of muscle recruitment during the barbell back squat. They found that the adductor magnus muscle was extremely active during the hip extension portion of the squat, as it produced more than 50% of the total hip extension. It was also noted that the greater the amount of knee flexion, the higher the involvement of the adductor magnus. And so at the bottom of a squat position, where we have the most amount of knee flexion, our adductors, not our glutes, are going to be the big boys firing to help get us out of the hole. Our glutes aren't going to be able to do much at the bottom of a squat position due to a shorter internal moment arm, but instead start contributing and kick in usually around parallel to help with that last final bit of hip extension. And so regarding knee valgus in a squat position, it should be brief, dynamic, bilateral, and should only occur on the concentric portion as they're coming up out of the bottom of a squat position. We'd expect to see knee valgus with high volume under fatigue, with moderate to heavy loads, and obviously with attempts close to your 1 rep maxes. I think it's important to note that this acceptable valgus variation in a squat is going to be different than the uncontrolled valgus that we may see on the descent of a squat, typically in new novel lifters or new squatters, simply because it is a new novel movement and they simply lack the motor control and skill acquisition to properly perform a squat. With that being said, a simple knees out cue could be beneficial for some, but not everyone. There may be a time and place for it, but do not abuse it and make it a universal cue for every single one of your athletes. Generally speaking, for the most part, if you're a trained individual who has some knee valgus in the bottom of a squat position, it's going to be a pretty safe movement that you shouldn't really worry about correcting. And honestly, it's probably an advantageous movement that's going to occur during heavier percentages anyways. However, there are some other factors that we should probably keep in mind as well when it comes to valgus in a squat. If there is knee valgus occurring in a squat, does it only occur under load, or does it happen at a body weight squat as well? If it does occur under load, at what percentages does it start occurring around? 20%, 50%, 80%, or 90%? If there is knee valgus, does it occur on both legs, or is it only occurring on one leg at a certain percentage? Is the person in front of you having knee pain or increased sensitivity on any other part of the body? Is the person in front of you trained, or are they completely a new novel lifter who has never squatted before? Like a lot of other things out there, there simply isn't a black and white answer when it comes to knee valgus. It's an extremely complex gray area with a ton of different variables and factors to keep in mind. The next time you're about to put someone in movement jail, just remember, there's a ton of individual movement variability that's gonna be acceptable and perfectly okay. So I hope you guys like this video. If you have any questions, comments, or want to see a video on any other topic, make sure you leave a comment down below. If you liked the video, make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Anyways, thank you for coming on TED Talk, and I will see you guys in the next video.